Has anyone wrongfully assumed you were dumb and, in the process, made themselves look really dumb? What's your story? Story 1. When I was a cashier in a grocery store, people always wanted to argue about produce. They would pull out a head of iceberg lettuce and insist that it was green cabbage and vice versa. I always smiled, voided the item, and charged what they thought the price was. The most gratifying part was seeing people come back later in the day, mortified that their coleslaw didn't turn out. But the best part was the sweet potatoes versus yams debate that I had with people many times during the week leading up to Thanksgiving. Most of what is sold in the U.S. is sweet potatoes, but some states, Louisiana, have a sweet potato market, and some states, Louisiana, have a sweet potato market. However, there is one state, Louisiana, that has a sweet potato that is grown in the United States. Grow some sweet potatoes that are the yam variety of sweet potato, but people often call them yams and fight over them. We did, too, but yams were seldom in stock and always more expensive than sweet potatoes. Anyway, sweet potatoes went on sale on holidays and everyone bought a lot of them. Each time, I would say, "These are yams." So I nullified them and sold them as yams at 4 times the price. When customers demanded the sale price, I kindly explained that I had tried to sell them at the sale price, but they asked me to sell them as yams instead. Story 2. Because this is one of my proudest moments. It was in my Society and Environment class in the 2nd semester of high school. One day, the teacher who had been teaching this class was no longer able to teach it, and a substitute teacher had to be found. On short notice, the school was able to arrange for a teacher 1 grade below me, a self-satisfied, born with a silver spoon on her S-type. She taught us SOS and used it as an opportunity to introduce SOS to her class. Anyway, after an hour or so, she started talking about the indigenous culture of the land, and for the most part she was largely correct. As someone with indigenous heritage and an interest in my own ancestry, sorry, I won't elaborate on any of this for the sake of anonymity, I was quite familiar with what she was talking about. But then she brought up a common misconception about migration and nomadic tendencies and spread it around the class as fact. I raised my hand and continued to correct her without her having to acknowledge me. I know it was a disgusting move, but she was the type of person who would not allow herself to be proven wrong in public. Predictably, she went on about her education and the fact that she had friends in the field. I could feel everyone's jaws drop when I said flippantly, "Okay, call one of them up right now." And she did. Mad Bench actually pulled out her cell phone and called a prominent figure in the field. She put it on speakerphone, asked a question about the subject of the debate, and the disembodied voice on the phone told her exactly the same thing I did. She hung up the phone, her eyes black and white and stunned. I jokingly said, "Please accept my apology in the form of an iced coffee," and left. In retrospect, I wish I had not said anything, but what happened next would not have been a good story. Next week I will be in another SOS class, and my regular teacher will be absent. She set up the class location in her classroom area, and we all moved over there when it was time to attend. When we walked into the classroom, she was taking attendance by the door, and, for some reason, stopped me. She put down her clipboard, said, "Excuse me," and produced a 2-liter plastic bottle of my favorite iced coffee and gave me a disgusted smile. Then she said something that was a mistake for both of us. I can't bring drinks or food into the classroom. No hesitation. Shaking the bottle lightly, I began to chug it right in front of her. I kept my pace and kept glancing at her face. She looked smug when she started drinking. When she finished a quarter of the bottle, she looked expectant, half impatient, 3/4 in denial. Nothing but bubbles at the bottom. Fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. Trying to maintain my composure, I tossed the bottle into a nearby trash can, said a cheerful thank you to her, and entered the classroom. As I entered the classroom, it was as if the Queen of England had walked in. I was in quiet awe because I had the nerve to not only correct her, but beat her at her own game. The bench prolonged the class and made me get up and walk around trying to break my bladder, but I used every ounce of my being to keep a straight, bright face and show no signs of weakness, even when class was over and everyone had left. Despite the massive abdominal cramps and racehorse pee afterwards, just seeing her flinch at the sight of me and second-guess herself was worth every minute of the past year. The moral of the story: spite is a great motivator, albeit a double-edged sword. Story 3. In the summers, I worked in retail stores to earn money for textbooks. At the time, there was a stigma that community colleges were for people who couldn't get into real college and were a legitimate place for minorities in particular. When the subject of school came up and I replied that I was in college before I could answer where, this white girl interrupted and said, "Oh, community college?" with an attitude. When I replied that I attended a private college in New York City, she immediately deflated and later, when asked about school, awkwardly admitted that she had dropped out. Edit. Also, I collect coins, and one day my father showed up with a really dirty and discolored buffalo nickel, told me with his usual attitude of being 100% correct that it was a rare coin, and insisted that I use my coin book to authenticate it. When I told him I had 20 that I could actually read the date on, he got really angry and advised me that his stuff was only melt value. He must have done his own research, because I later found the coins left on a bookshelf, LPT. If someone tries to sell you a Morgan silver coin for more than the price per ounce of silver, it's most likely a scam. There are only a limited number of Morgans that are actually worth anything, and you should not buy any of them that do not have a reliable certificate of authenticity. Also, don't spend a lot of money on rainbow Morgans because most Morgans these days are artificially toned. Story 4. I used to work at a Marriott hotel with a courtyard. This hotel is for businessmen who get up early and work late. This hotel is for businessmen who get up early and work late. The hotel was 5 stories high and had about 200 guest rooms. It was right next to LAX, so there were always a lot of businessmen, and their companies would fly them out to work in Los Angeles. Whatever. One day I was working the front desk, and one of the guests came in drunk, I guess around midnight, and asked me to reset his room key before he went to his room. So I said, yeah, no problem. Good night. He came down 5 minutes later, obviously upset, and said, I'm sorry. I told you to remake the key. In the customer service business, you are not allowed to talk back, raise your voice, or assert your opinion. So I apologized, took responsibility, said I would not do it again, and made him an additional key. He took the key from my hand and left for his room. 5 minutes later, he came back down. What's the matter with you? Are you S***D? Are you wasting my time on purpose? I'm going to my room. Bring me my room key. He then threw the key at me. My manager saw this going on and let me handle it. I was furious, of course, and went to the break room and just paced around, wondering what could make someone so bold. Eventually, my manager came back and walked into the break room with a smile on his face. His room was 1 floor up. He said he was sorry, he said. I wanted to see his face. Story 5. I worked at Trader Joe's. At my store, cases of water were backstocked at the front of the store near the cash registers. In other words, all the products were right next to the cash register. I knew what was there because I had unloaded a pallet with all the water that morning. As I was training a new employee on the cash register, a woman came in and asked for a case of sports bottles. I told her that we had no more in stock this morning and that we were sold out for the day. She says, "Can you go check in the back and see if it's still there?" I say, "Actually, I am unloading the water today, but all the cases of water bottles are right here in the front, so I just get them for the customer. I don't have any sport tops today, so how about a case of screw tops?" She smirked and looked at the person I was training and said, "I'm sorry, I don't have any screw top cases for you." So I told them to go and do it. To my surprise, the new hire came back and told me. I said, "Well, I asked our manager if there was water in the back, and he said, all the water is in the front." I stopped scanning the woman's merchandise, looked her square in the eye, and asked, "What do you think?" So I went to, "Would you like a screw top case?" She rolled her eyes, said no, and remained silent throughout the transaction. Bench. Story 6. When I was in college, a woman, spent my summers doing drywall. My father was a drywaller, and the owner agreed to give me a chance. One day, I was having lunch with the guys, and one of my buddies started talking about piece rate jobs. Another commented about not paying a pension, including a union pension, and he said, "You are too young to worry about a pension." I then said, "You are never too young to worry about your pension." Buddy turned around and said, "I'm not going to take financial advice from a 17-year-old. I was 23. I was 23. Once I told him he was an ignorant jerk, explained that I was older than him and that he was too ****D to understand how pensions work. He laughed and I went back to work, rolling my eyes more than ever. The joys of being a woman in a male-dominated field, LOL. Story 7. I don't know if this applies, but a coworker recently found out I do HEMA and challenged me to a fistfight spar, despite my warnings, without protectors because he thinks protectors are ****D. I gave him several opportunities to walk away from the situation, but he insisted. Finally, he accepted and said he wanted to do it in the parking lot below our place of work. What he didn't know was that I used to do Wing Chun, and for a short time I also did boxing, judo, and karate. He couldn't even kick properly, yet he was beaten to perfection without me having to put up my guard. What's even funnier is that he admitted to another colleague that he didn't think I would beat him because he had done BJJ before. Editor's note. My colleague challenged me to a fistfight thinking he would win and ended up getting his butt kicked instead. Story 8. When I was younger, I never studied. Even when I was in class on test day, somehow I almost always knew the answers. Since I didn't seem to be paying attention, most teachers and students thought I wasn't very smart. After taking the test several times, most teachers thought I was cheating. I was called into the principal's office several times. Each time I explained that I knew the answers because most of the tests were really easy, but no one believed me and told me to take the test again under supervised supervision. Even if the questions were different, I was an SD and the tests were super easy. I'm talking about ages 12 to 15 here. I was given an unwilling B every time, even though sometimes I had no wrong answers or showed my work when needed. They just didn't want to give me an A because I was a big guy. Tall, muscular, no sports, but somehow insanely strong. I was that kind of kid. People always made fun of me because of that. I mean, how could you be tall, strong, and smart? Nope. I was annoying at recess. I smoked with other CPUI kids. I hung out with kids who drank alcohol. And I did ***D things that marked me out as a kid who could barely read a children's book. I especially remember when I was about 12 or 13, I had the opportunity to freely choose a book to review. I chose The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. When I replied, "Yes, I haven't read this book since I was 9, but I love all 5 volumes," the teacher gave me a funny look, sighed, and moved on. To quote what was said in front of the principal, "No child can read such a thick book in a little over 4 days." By then, I had read the book 2 or 3 times. I loved Adam's humor. Needless to say, I think my school let me down quite a bit. Story 9. I worked in the IT department as a help desk. We had a workbench in our office where anyone could set up a machine to work on a problem or test software. The workbench was basically right outside my office. One day, a Tier 3 tech, we'll call him X, was testing something and brought his computer in and connected it to one of the networks. There was an internal network and a network connected outside the firewall for testing. This particular project was so important that it took about 20 minutes for all the technicians to come in to see what was going on. One tech in particular has a very grating, I know everything attitude. We'll call him Y. X has a laid-back attitude about everything, but this issue is causing him a little stress. No one can successfully log into the machine. Y tries a few times, but eventually has to go back to work. So I approach the machine, check it out, fix the problem to get it to log in, and X comes back, elated that he was able to test what he was testing. A short time later, Y shows up and says, "It's not working. I didn't log in." "Yes, I logged in while you were gone." Y says, "I can't log in." Y says, "I can't log in." So X changed and told it to Y. Y said, "I'm logged in." Y walked away, and X went back to the machine. Before he did, he said to me, "Sorry, thanks for letting me log in." I didn't see Y for the rest of the day. Story 10. My natural hair color is bleach blonde, and from the late 90s to 2010, I was the web services team coordinator for a fairly large brand, doing all the server maintenance and upgrades, data warehousing, programming, creative content, etc. I did my best under my direction. Especially in the 90s, I was mistaken for a booth babe. I hope I still am not. Also, whenever I asked a question about a product, the sales rep, always a man back then, would ask me if the technical manager was with me. This was about 20% of the time back then, and I was always shocked. Then I would start asking them highly technical questions that they really couldn't answer, and I would make them feel bad about their assumptions. Things have changed dramatically in the last 15 to 20 years. The number of women representing product teams has increased dramatically, and people no longer ask me about my IT director. Maybe it helps that the badge I wear has my job title on it, but that was true 25 years ago. At least at the conferences I attend, there are no more booth babes. Story 11. Backstory. At the time, I was a petite 19-year-old girl working in a male-dominated industry as a pastry chef, attending a culinary school in Napa Valley. There were 2 schools in the same city. My school, 13-month curriculum, max 18 students per year, $20,000 tuition, and a big brand school for year degree, hundreds of students, $64,000 per semester. I was not sure why I was so interested in the 2 schools, because the head chef lecturer who ran my school was married to one of the curriculum directors at the big brand school, and they loved friendly competition. Anyway, my school offered 9 months of classes and a 4-month internship in a restaurant. I was lucky enough to work in a newly opened restaurant in the middle of downtown Napa with chefs who had worked in some of the best restaurants in the U.S. I gained a lot of experience and probably learned more in those 4 months than I did in the rest of my education. I managed to work my way up to Chef du Part. I was in charge of one part of the kitchen and also in charge of the commis, and worked on the line. I was 19 years old, fresh out of culinary school, had already completed the first half level of the brigade system, and was committed to luxury fine dining cuisine that I could brag about for the rest of my life. I worked 6 days a week, 10 plus hours a day. I loved it. We hired a new commis prep cook who was in his 3rd year at a prestigious culinary school. He was cool at first, but when he found out my age, about 24 at the time, and that I attended a small school, a poor man's cooking school in his actual words, he started being a jerk to me. He stopped calling me chef and instead called me by a cutesy nickname that I repeatedly asked him not to use. He began talking to me as if I were his annoying little sister trying to play along with him and his friends. The executive chef had added lamb shoulder to the menu, and we were to buy it, and Deb won it. I volunteered because I had done it before and knew I was good at it, but I didn't volunteer because Comey also insisted that I would fail. The executive let us both do it because it would go faster, and left it at that. We worked on 4 shoulders at a time, and I finished 2 before he could barely finish half of the first shoulder. Unbeknownst to Comey's, I and the rest of my classmates had been BD by one of the best artisan BRS in Napa County, and his skills were tops in our class. I have B*** red pork halves, beef quarters, salmon, tuna, rabbit, snakes, and a variety of other proteins. I may be a pastry chef, but I know how to handle a knife. Not the best, but definitely better than a rich 24-year-old kid who doesn't know how to convert ounces to grams. I don't know what that means out of context, but the metric system is used in cooking. Important stuff to know before working in an actual restaurant. Story 12. As a lifeguard, the rule was that there had to be an adult in the main pool within arm's reach. I saw this mother and her 5-year-old come in. The mother was wearing jeans on the phone and clearly did not intend to swim. I anticipated this problem and went to talk to her before the child entered the pool. I explained that the pool was at least 4 feet deep, that this policy was for the safety of the child, and that having a parent nearby who could respond immediately in the event of a drowning would be much faster than relying on a lifeguard to get down, jump in, and swim out to rescue her. She said it was a ridiculous policy, that her child was born a good swimmer, that she could take him to the lake and he would swim no problem, that I was just harassing him, that I just didn't want to do my job. Literally, while she was telling me this, the child ran and jumped into the pool. The dog paddled out about 3 meters from the edge and just drowned. She signed a refusal to care and walked away faster than anyone I have ever seen. The poor kid looked so sorry for herself and so angry that she was thought to be so S***D. Story 13. I'm a waitress now. I came back to the industry after years of working a normal job, and everyone thinks I'm a high school dropout with 6 kids and 3 boyfriends living in my car. It's ridiculously common to have old ladies tell me that I really should go back to school and get a degree, or tell me that I should look into schools, or ask me what I'm going to do next, or ask me something equally condescending and personal. And I always reply that I actually already have a college degree and have been working a stressful job in a big city for the past few years and took this job when I moved back to my hometown during COVID. He continues, I also like this job, and now I am making an equivalent amount of money with far less stress and obligations. This is my job, so don't make fun of me. If it wasn't for people like me who would bring the beer. Catering, however, is not an easy job. I don't know why it is considered appropriate conversation for restaurant workers when you don't go to the grocery store and ask the bagger why he isn't a doctor. People who work in restaurants see a lot of C***P. Story 14. I was generally lazy in high school because I had untreated severe migraines. Because of this, I spent the first 3 years of my life inconspicuously in classes that were slightly below AP, but above standard. Those who knew me personally knew that I was not dumb, just apathetic and unwilling to put unnecessary mental strain on myself unless absolutely necessary. Despite this, I maintained a B2A average in most classes. In my second year of high school, I was prescribed a medication that helped to clear the fog. It was an advanced biology class with my favorite teacher, and the project was to create a report, PowerPoint, printout, and presentation on a genetic disease of my choosing. I chose it because I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and wanted to learn more about it. The presentations were set for 5 to 15 minutes, and I was first in line, but some people needed extensions, so I ended up being first overall. The professor consistently asked questions that I could answer and gave me a lot of credit for the layout of my presentation and handouts, in addition to how I presented the information. I had taken a class earlier in the semester with another great teacher that dealt with workplace skills and public speaking, so at that point things came natural, and I thought I was just doing things at a good enough level at best. However, the teacher and other students, some of whom asked questions specifically to trip me up, kept asking questions in response to my pertinent answers, and my presentation went over 30 minutes. The students who were low and abusive were the egomaniacs who thought they could handle this assignment with ease. When my presentation was over, the teacher came to the front of the class and complimented me on the quality, breadth, and handouts of my presentation, all of which met the minimum criteria for an A grade. Several of the top students who were supposed to follow my lead requested an extension to redo the entire project over the weekend, and several of them got B grades or better after being disrespected for how they blew off my presentation. Conversely, people who were close friends with me asked me to help them tune up their projects, and most of them got high marks despite not being good presenters because of the content or format layout. One girl, who is supposed to be one of the top students in my grade, had a moderate mental breakdown as a result of trying to be perfect in her presentation and ended up with a low grade of C, although it was an acceptable grade. Story 15. I am dyslexic, and because of this, I was homeschooled for most of my pre-college education. My family was the only homeschoolers in the area, and somehow everyone seemed to agree that we must all be really dumb. I entered public school for the first time in 6th grade, and by the end of my first week, a lot of the girls led by one of the top girls in class, would tease me and ask me if I could read. Once they realized I could read, they calmed down a bit, but it took them a while to stop assuming I was S***D. This was back at the end of that year. Where I grew up, there was a big standardized test at the end of 6th grade, with prizes for the top 3 finishers. I came in second, my best friend, who is the daughter of the high school principal, came in first, and the girl who was teasing me came in third. I beat her by less than a point. My mistake was small, but second place was not as satisfying. Incidentally, my siblings also made it clear that they were no fools, and over the next 2 years or so, my parents' ridicule of their decision turned into quite a bit of respect. Story 16. During my senior year of high school, I won the starting pitcher position on my baseball team. I was the only left-handed pitcher on the team until one left-handed pitcher transferred to my school my senior year. He was cocky. He was cocky because the coach wanted lefties to pitch against each other. And he was a talker. He said he would inadvertently beat me. He also got along well with the senior pitcher that the team was talking about being the starting pitcher. In the first game, the senior pitcher started and gave up 4 runs in the first inning. The manager sent him down in the 3rd inning and brought in a new left-handed pitcher. He gave up another run and kept giving up walks. Then the manager pulled him in the same inning. When I came on, we finished the inning. No runs scored. He held the other team scoreless the rest of the game, and when I came up to bat, he gave up a single and a double. Since then, the other left fielder has been very good to me. Story 17. When we disassembled the Mossberg 500 for the last shooting qualification, the GM, gunner's mate, instructed us to have all the weapons cleaned, but not to touch the guns until he explained step by step. He forgot to tell everyone in what order to brush and swab the gun barrels after cleaning them. When I, the nagging E5, raised my hand and asked him what order to do it in, he, the arrogant E4, said in a very polite tone, "I told you before, it's your fault for not paying attention. Pay attention to the details, E. I calmly looked around and asked for someone to speak up now to see if I had told them the correct order to clean the barrels. Almost everyone mumbled no, and the rest just shook their heads. To cut through the tedium and bring it to a satisfactory conclusion, I talked to his supervisor, also an E5, about his behavior and had him clean the gun while I inspected the barrel. I let him clean the gun for 4 hours. His supervisor stopped by several times to remind him that attention to detail was important. Those were good times. Story 18. I deliver food to a variety of supermarkets, but this time I will discuss a fairly large supermarket chain. They don't communicate and often make quick decisions without thinking things through. Anyway, I recently delivered an Easter-themed product to one of them. Before Easter Sunday, I took the last few remaining boxes and took them off the shelves. I replaced them with spring-themed merchandise that really had nothing to do with Easter to anyone who would look at the boxes for 2 seconds. One Monday morning, I went to the store and the spring-themed cakes had been boxed up and placed in the back without my knowledge. I quickly took it out of the box and put it back on the shelf. The word Easter did not appear anywhere on the packaging, but I knew that the quick-tempered manager had taken it off the shelf because he thought it was an Easter product. Eventually, I decided to bring in 10 more cases. Then they would think twice about doing such a stupid thing again. Sure enough, 3 days later, I received an email from the clerk stating that the manager wanted this item removed with no explanation, along with a picture of the item I had purchased in the spring. I got the manager's phone number, called him, and asked what was wrong. Sure enough, he replied in a cocky voice, "Easter is over. You act like I'm an idiot for keeping Easter merchandise on the shelves past the holiday. Read the box. It doesn't say Easter." I said. After a long pause of silence, he said, "Okay, I'll check the pictures again and call you back," he said. Perhaps he was embarrassed. After that, the item remained up and was never touched. Without even reading the box, he assumed it was an Easter item and tried to remove my $2,000 item from the shelves. I am not stupid and have been in this business for 15 years. I can't read what is on the box for 2 seconds before I remove thousands of dollars worth of merchandise from the shelves and hope to lose store sales in the process. Story 19. I just started working on a production line for an auto parts manufacturer. I was hot pressing rivets into the base plate of an emergency brake. According to the production logbook, the daily production count was 300 pieces. The tolerance was 3 pieces. I worked there for 2 weeks, and the line supervisor advised my management consultant that I was not meeting production requirements. According to the log, I had 0 errors and was exceeding my daily quota of 300 pieces. Another line supervisor confided in me that he would replace me with my cousin, who had just arrived from the Philippines. I did not argue or protest. The managing consultant knew as well, but had no leverage. After reviewing my resume and confirming that I had a degree in computer science and certification to write technical manuals, I was returned to the very same production floor in a different role. I had to document every single product produced at every workstation with an illustrated inspection reference guide. When I arrived at the office, the former line supervisor presented me with a 4-turn take. Patrick Stewart was no match for him. No one told me what my role was. I was there like a field inspector. I walked the entire floor, borrowing templates, taking measurements, and taking pictures. It looked very official. My former line supervisor thought I was assigned to her production line as a ringer to inspect her. She worked every day worrying that I was getting ready to fire her. She confided that concern confidentially to others who knew her well. No one corrected her. They just told her not to worry. Story 20. I am an audio engineer for several major record companies in a large music city. I am a woman, but this field is extremely male-dominated. I get a lot of blind date sessions where I am just called in and don't know who I am working with until I get there, and sometimes it is the same on the client side. I am the only one in the room, sitting at my computer with the recording software up, and when they arrive I ask, "Where's the engineer?" When I answer that it's me, the client is disappointed and sometimes complains that they need someone else. The studio manager simply assures them that they will be fine if I try to do the same. They are still usually not satisfied, at which point I realize that I either do it or I don't record it. After the first few minutes of recording, they ask if I will take sessions outside of the studio, what the fee is, and my phone number so they can hire me for sessions at other studios. They go from thinking I know nothing to telling me I will be their engineer in less than 10 to 15 minutes. It's exhausting and annoying because it happens so often, but they don't realize that I've been doing this job for over 10 years and know what I'm doing. Story 21. I didn't necessarily make fun of anyone, but it sure made some people feel bad. I lived in Germany for a year after high school as part of an exchange program. I had to make phone calls to doctors, employers, program coordinators, etc., so I got pretty comfortable with answering the phone in German. I was able to speak fairly fluently on the phone, but since it was not my native language, there were of course small grammatical errors. This led to the unfortunate situation that when I was on the phone, people thought I was German because I could speak well enough, but because I made so many mistakes, they thought I was also an idiot. On the phone, they thought it was because they thought I was S***D and were quite rude to me. When I revealed that I was a foreigner, they were always surprised and complimentary of my German. Story 22. I lived in an apartment complex for 4 years. I always paid my rent on time, followed the rules, etc. I had a few problems, including a water heater that flooded, and they did not pay for the damage. At that time, I had to pay a large gas bill. So I ended up going to move out. Then they wouldn't give me my security deposit back. The lady in the office said I had to talk to my roommate and get it back from her. That should never happen if you have not gone through the application, background check, and all that. I paid the deposit to the office, not to my roommate. And I was obviously there long before her. The lady in the office talked down to me and even laughed at me as if this was the norm. I never paid my roommate anything and always worked through the office. So I had to repeat this and finally contacted the people above her and told them what happened. The lady in the office sent me an email apologizing and said she would get me a refund right away. My deposit was returned in full, and when I went to pick up my package, since my family didn't know my new address, I could only hope that she had been fired because it was someone else who managed the complex. Story 23. One of my law school classes. He worked from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and took classes from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. I worked hard enough to keep my grades around 3.0. I was mostly quiet. I chatted only when necessary, or only for class. At one point, I was assigned to a group. The leader of my group was not happy that I was in that group. He went to complain to the teacher and asked that I be assigned to another group because he thought I was a bad student, lazy, unmotivated, and a burden on the project. College classes were slow-paced, and I was in one of the mid-career classes. I prioritized work over college. So I ended up in that class with a guy who was a grade below me. I could hear him talking to the teacher. The rest of my classmates were indifferent to the situation. I honestly didn't care what happened after a hard day's work. The teacher said, "No, take him away." I stood up and told the teacher. Join another group or I'll do it myself. The teacher was not happy, but I am friends with him, so he said okay. The day of the project presentation finally arrived. I sat at the end of the class as usual, daydreaming without being told what to do. My turn came. I could hear everyone talking and commenting on how I had decided to do it alone and how I wouldn't be able to pass. I crushed the entire presentation, doing it all by myself. The teacher chuckled because I was perfect and he knew why. I got up from my seat. Everyone finished their presentations. The teacher ended the class by congratulating the top two, who did better. I was first. The teacher asked me to explain why I was perfect. I said, Gabriel, the teacher's name. Are you really doing this now? I'm tired. Shall we go now? He laughed, stepped forward, and told me to explain my job. Hello. My name is full name, and I have been working as a legal assistant for the past 2 years. Prior to that, I have worked in every position possible within a law firm since I was 12 years old. I also do consulting work. I do not yet have a law degree or license, so I am not legally allowed to accept cases on my own. Therefore, I take cases and resolve them, and attorneys in my firm do the rest of the work as assistants. I look at the doctor and say, Are we done? Shall we go now? The teacher burst out laughing and said, I don't want to name names, but a group in this class decided to kick this guy out of the group. This group didn't even do a good presentation tonight. This class needs to do better. It's a shame that only one person and one group could give a good presentation. You need to study harder to pass the class. The class is over. The project was a case about real estate, estates, a child who lost his rich parents, and a corrupt lawyer who takes advantage of this child and his poor grandmother. I don't remember the details. Story 24. TLDR, I was blamed for not finding the BFB, big freaking bug, earlier. So, big company. I was on the testing team. We were on deadline for an internet project we had been working on for months. The programmer, who had been working overtime for weeks, brought the code to us, and we started testing. We broke the code. We found huge sections of code that needed to be rewritten. The deadline was looming. Not good. They want total mobilization and testing when the programmers finally hand over the new, completely revised code. Testing front to back and twice in the middle. The schedule went something like this. Monday morning, the programmer passes the completely revised new code to the testers. It is estimated that all testing will take 1 week, which includes the weekend work. We attack it. We break it. We test it. Wednesday, we break it. Actually, I broke it. We find a big bug that stops us from testing, a BFB, big freaking bug. We all agree, but we are too cultured to call it that. Nevertheless, because of the BFB, we missed the deadline. Friday, the big guys call a big meeting. Everyone from testers to programmers to project managers and their bosses were there. 20 people in the room. You have to shake your head. At the beginning of the meeting, the head basically turned to me and asked me, personally, why I hadn't found BFB sooner. After all, I had weeks of time. I only find bugs. I don't create them. Usually testers are not blamed for finding bugs, nor are they blamed for finding BFBs in new, completely revised code. I'm glad more diplomatic heads prevailed. My team leader stood up and calmly explained that I could not have found the BFB prior to that week. In fact, he said I had found BFB much earlier. Top understood and focused on the project designer, who probably would have thrown his own programmer under the bus. I was stunned that I had been targeted and do not remember what happened after the meeting. Thus, I learned that, despite what you may think, even the head of a Fortune 50 company has absolutely no idea what is going on with this project. Story 25. I used to work in a debt collection call center, and one day I wrote up a basic algorithm in Microsoft Excel to calculate compound interest on a debt. I showed it to my area manager, AM, and he scolded me for wasting company time. It didn't take long. I got a call from the CEO a week later after the AM emailed him what I had done. He asked if I would be willing to incorporate this feature into the debt collection software code so that everyone could use it. I told him that I would sell the company the right to use my very basic algorithm, which a technical person could probably figure out in 10 minutes, for $15,000. He took me up on the offer and had AM himself hand me a check. The following week, I resigned. I knew that the AM would resent me in the future, and that I would not do any more good working there. I then took a month off and easily found a new job. Story 26. I am French and live in France, but grew up in England and consider English to be something of a native language. When I was 17, I had to transfer from a private school to a public school. This was for personal reasons, but my new classmates assumed it was because my grades were too low, and I was kicked out Private schools had higher standards. Anyway, on the first day of school, we had English class. The teacher handed out a list of sentences we had to translate and asked us to compare our translations with our neighbors. The first sentence was quite difficult to translate from French, and after looking around at our answers, the teacher announced that only one person in the class had gotten it right. We compare our answers with the person next to us. The girl next to me looks at my translation and asks, "How long has it been raining?" And she started laughing. For a long time, the whole time. That's the **** thing I've ever heard in my life, I said, and the other girl sitting next to me teased me for a while. Being a new student and knowing she was going to make fun of me in the next few minutes, I didn't say anything. Sure enough, the teacher said I was right, and my classmates quickly discovered that I was actually fluent in English and had pretty good grades. This made it really hard for me to make friends. But I hope the kid learned the lesson that you should never make fun of someone without knowing the whole story. Or better yet, never make fun of people. Story 27. I used to drive a forklift in a warehouse attached to a retail store. The manager of the retail store, who did not have a forklift license, was in the warehouse and watched as my coworker and I loaded the bins onto the shelves from the bins we lifted. It was much more efficient than carrying 20-pound bags up a ladder over and over to a high shelf, and we could do it in a safe way with the bins flush against the shelves, so my coworker could get to the ladder, just slide them from the bin to the shelf while he is on the ladder. The forklift is stopped and locked in place while he moves the load. The retail manager doesn't say anything to me, but assumes I am doing something improper and putting my coworker at risk. She goes to a higher manager who is also unlicensed, not my manager who is licensed but gave me a license, and tells him I am doing something unsafe. The retail manager tells me, unlicensed, that he does not understand what he is seeing, and the retail manager told me off, not licensed, even though he did not understand what he was looking at. And a higher manager accused me based on information he got from someone who is also not licensed. Story 28. Maybe not exactly. But once me and this girl were both wearing Queen shirts, and she looked at me and grinned and said, "Oh, you like Queen? Then what's your favorite song?" And cue my hyperfixation rave. I am obsessed with Queen. It's hard to choose, but I love anything Brian wrote, and Queen 2 is my favorite because everything on it is so good, and I love the fantastic whimsy of the early Rise songs, but I also love the hard rock feel of songs like Dead on Time and Stone Cold Crazy. I also like the hard rock feel of songs like Dead on Time and Stone Cold Crazy. And I'm not even talking about favorite members, but how I love the relationship between Brian and Roger, how the four of them were perfect for each other without any reason that Deaky is chronically underrated, and how all their styles melded together to create one of the most amazing I've ever heard. I can't stop talking about how they became one immaculate cacophony of sound. And obviously, there was no hate, which is still valid, but the look on her face when she finally made me stop was hilarious. Maybe it was disgust. Maybe it was the weirdest person I've ever met. Story 29. A little longer than I thought. I, F30, worked in the IT department of a state government. At the time, our mail server was running out of capacity, so we had a second drive set up and ready to replace the current undercapacity drive during routine maintenance. Importantly, the existing drive contained all the boot information and programs the mail server needed to run. I had the same information ready to go on the new drive, so I only needed to do a few configuration tasks during maintenance after the replacement. Since my boss, M50, was one of those people who liked to do things himself and would ultimately take credit for other people's work, I was concerned that he would try to prematurely put in the new drive without knowing the actual steps needed to make it work. I told him that the new drive was ready to go, but that he would need to wait for scheduled maintenance that weekend to replace it. I specifically explained to him that he would have to wait for I specifically told him that I did not want him to put in a new drive because it would make the server unbootable and stop all email flow within the agency. He kicked me to the curb and said he was not ***D and did not need me to tell him how to do his job. I understood. The next day I was on vacation and just running errands. Around 10 a.m., I was at the grocery store when I received a frantic phone call from my best friend and coworker. My boss decided to do the swap during business hours because it was a 5-minute job, his words. The server went down and would not come back up. An hour later, The CIO came in and the boss made excuses and said he was working on it. After another hour, the CIO comes in and sits over the boss's shoulder. Finally, the boss undid the swap. The server was back up, the emails were flowing again, and the day was saved. The CIO and the executives think he is a hero for single-handedly fixing this terrible problem, but the entire IT staff thinks he is a hero for what happened. The CIO and executives thought he was a hero for single-handedly solving this terrible problem, but the entire IT staff knew exactly what had happened, and their respect for him waned even more. When I returned to work the next day, he would not look me in the eye, never brought it up, and acted as if nothing had happened. This same supervisor was not ready or experienced enough for me when the same CIO tried to promote me. I left that agency and got an equivalent promotion at another agency. Then less than a year later, the CIO offered me another, higher promotion. I did, but again the boss refused to admit any fault of his own, TLDR. I told the boss not to do something, but he did it anyway and took down the email service for an entire state agency. Story 30. They assumed me and my friend were idiots, although let's face it, my friend isn't very smart. We were at a bar on a college campus, obviously before COVID, and we were both pretending to be students. My friend ended up approaching the two women, trying to make a good impression. He pretended to be in the same class as the girls. The girls obviously didn't believe it, but were amused nonetheless. At that moment, a male college student interrupted the conversation. The male student, one of the worst haircuts I've ever seen, began pressing my friend for more details about the class. One of the girls told the guy to leave, but to no avail. My friend, who probably should have bailed at this point to save us all the trouble, elaborated and even described it as elementary. Uni students love that. It's a moment that proves how pretentious and know-it-all I am. I was wondering if you could give me some insight into the development of the market economy in the southern colonies. My contention is that the economic pattern in the pre-Revolutionary War, especially in the southern colonies, can be most appropriately characterized as agrarian pre-capitalism. My friend may not be the smartest guy, but he is very loyal and will give you the shirt off his back. In fact, he gave me an old car for my birthday that year. So I cut him off with this. Of course you insist. I said. You'll be sure of that until you read James Lemon next month. Then we'll talk about how entrepreneurial and capitalistic the Virginia and Pennsylvania economies were in 1740. That will go on until next year. You're here to repeat Gordon Wood's story and talk about pre-revolutionary utopias and the capital-forming effects of military mobilization. The college student was clearly amazed at my knowledge. I had never been to college in my life. I had never been to college. He said, "No, as a matter of fact, I don't." Wood underestimates the impact of and tried to redeem himself. He had underestimated my talent. He thought he could fix this and make himself look good in front of these women. I did not. I fearlessly said, Wood greatly underestimates the impact of wealth, especially social distinctions that are predicated on inherited wealth. I interjected. You got that from page 421 of Essex County Jobs, didn't you? Do you have any thoughts of your own on this matter? Or do you? Is it your way of coming to a bar, reading a passage you don't understand, pretending it's your own idea, making a good impression on the girls, and embarrassing your friends? He looked completely dumbfounded, but I knew I had to get him. The sad thing about men like you is that in another 50 years, you'll start thinking for yourself and realize that there are two certainties in life. One is that you shouldn't do that. And two, that I spent $105,000 on a ridiculous education that I could have received for a $1.50 overdue fee at the public library. Yeah, but you can still get a degree. I'm going to feed the kids French fries at the drive-thru on the way to the ski resort. At that point, I could only smirk and reply, well, maybe. But at least I won't be unoriginal. Story 31. I'm not exactly SD, but I'm a really SD beginner. I've been sewing for a few years now, and recently I've been going to a sewing class to learn how to do cool projects. As I was walking in, the teachers started talking about me and were like, you're one of those kids again, and sayonara if you try it. But soon I would prove them wrong. Some of them talked about me, said almost the same things, and acted as if they were somehow better than me. So basically, it was me versus the whole class. "Can I help you wind a bobbin? Do you want me to show you how to wind a bobbin?" It was very rude, but I was cool with it. "No, it's okay." At first she seemed surprised, but then she thought I was lying and said, "Well, I know you need help, so let's just stay here." I wound the bobbin and threaded the sewing machine. The teacher still wasn't convinced, so she used me as a sample to sew the first part. It's okay if you don't know how to start a stitch or stop a stitch. We all know you're a sewing novice. Some of the kids snickered, but I quickly proved them wrong. "You do lock your stitches, don't you?" She, of course, rudely said yes. I sewed a perfectly straight line. She looked at my work and asked, "How long have you been sewing?" I answered 2 or 3 years. The whole class was puzzled, and the teacher looked amused. Needless to say, I finished the project and never went to that sewing place again. Story 32. In the early 2000s, I had to work out of town with another guy, and the company only gave us one hotel room. I was in my 20s, and he was in his 40s, I think. He was watching a lot of stuff on his laptop while I was watching TV. I thought for a minute and replied something like, "Well, I know it's growing, but I've never used Facebook Messenger or Skype, so I can't speak from personal experience." He sighed and said, "I wasn't talking about Skype. I was talking about VoIP. VoIP being an acronym for Voice over Internet Protocol. It is a general term for systems that allow users to communicate with others by sending voice over the Internet. Skype is designed to do video calls, and Facebook Messenger has that capability as well," he said. He blinked and said quietly, "Oh." Then he turned back to his laptop. Story 33. I used to project manage train modifications. I was in charge of a particularly difficult door modification on one train, and the train's operations manager was ABD from the moment he realized he had to deal with a female project manager with waist-length blonde hair who didn't look 30. I was over 30, but looked much younger. I was ABD. At the time, I drove a big gray Volvo, but I had a job to do, so I drove my fun car to work that week. The fleet director saw it in the parking lot and commented that he immediately recognized the Barbie car as mine. Someone asked what kind of car it was out of curiosity, and when I told him it was a Peugeot 207 convertible, he said, "No, that's a VW Beetle." Not wanting to embarrass him any further, I tried to keep the meeting going until we went on coffee break, but he brought it up again. At that time, some of us were out for a cigar break and saw the car. They looked uncomfortable because it was obviously not a Beetle, but they did not stand up for me. He started laughing that he didn't know what kind of car I owned and that I only had it because I wanted a pink car. I actually let my daughter pick it out, but none of these men knew I had a child. I wish I could say he backed down, but all he said was that there were supposed to be 2 Barbie pink cars when he passed by the parking lot, but all he saw was one Beetle. He really was one heck of an idiot. Story 34. Recently, a director at work did this. We work with many different agencies. He tried to bring me down in front of other departments and supervisors by saying I did not serve 2 locations. I told everyone why that one site was not being served. That site did not qualify for the service he was talking about. Since it was a Zoom meeting, I asked to see the screen. I showed him the evidence that this site was not eligible. I then asked him why he thought that, why he felt the need to check my office site, why he felt the need to make sure I was doing my job, even though he was not my supervisor or director and did not work in my office. This is because he found out that I was not providing services at another office that I claimed to be receiving services from. I could easily prove that they were indeed receiving services. After all, he looked like an overzealous butthead trying to get me fired or steal my funds, and I looked competent and professional. People are still mad at him for this and don't believe anything he says anymore. Story 35. Went out to a bar to meet a friend and his business associates. They all worked in telesales and wore suits and acted like they were wolves on Wall Street or something. I remember I was dressed casually and the crotch of my jeans was slightly ripped. My friends would call me one of their coworkers, let's call him Steve, hypothetically. Steve asked about my job. I modestly replied, musician marketing, to which he mistakenly assumed that I was a flyer slinger and said that I was too old to be doing flyer slinging and promoting club nights and that I needed to get a real job doing phone sales like he did. His other friends started laughing and said, I don't think you could get a job like ours. I let them both joke around, and when they were done, I said, no, I'm doing this, and opened my phone and showed them projects and tours I've done with some of the biggest Grammy-winning musicians that I can't write about here. Steve and the other guy instantly shut up and turned red. Then I purposely asked my friend if he wanted to go with me to see Ariana Grande in a few weeks, just to show them off and prove a point. They looked like fools and I felt like a fool too. Don't judge people by their looks. Story 36. I worked for a small chain of 5 salons for several years in the mid-90s. I ran the front desk, was an assistant manager, did all the bookkeeping, inventory control, etc. Hiring, firing, almost everything but the hair. I was very good at using 10 key data like in Star Trek, and I was very confident in my accounting. Managers and stylists embraced my alternative vibe, liked me, and trusted me. I don't want to say they held a grudge against me, but it was clear they didn't mind me being gone. One week, the branch called me and told me there was a problem with my accounting. I assured them that my calculations were correct and asked them to recheck theirs. They said yes and asked me to come to their office. I did so. They showed me their calculations. I pointed out their errors. They dismissed it with a and our meeting was over. Story 37. After college, I moved to a new city for work. Since I would be in town for a while, I decided to check out the local bars in search of a less stressful job. The goal was to wash dishes with a beer in hand and get to know people in between washing dishes. In fact, that worked too. But one of the cooks hated doing dishes and kept bad-mouthing me every night. He said I was S***D, useless, and nothing. I didn't care what he said about me, even though I was making a good salary at my day job. Above all, I thought he was projecting himself. I overheard the cook's owner, whom I had finally befriended, lashing out at me again, and I told him all about my day job, that I had graduated from college, that I only worked for beer, that I met people, and everything else. He heard it and never came back after that shift. Story 38. It's getting late, and I'm lost. I was a brilliant high school student, good at sports, but a quiet kid from a small town. Everyone knew I had above average brains, but I was a unique nerd. I got along with everyone, but there was no such thing as a clique. My Spanish teacher wasn't exactly brilliant, and her classes were ridiculously easy. A little over halfway through the year, I took a quiz and finished it in about 15 minutes. The teacher graded it. I got a 97 or so. While the quiz was still going on, she called me to her desk, where I had an IEP, which was an individualized education plan for students with learning disabilities, usually bordering on needing special education. Not only was I speechless, but the entire class burst out laughing at her words. She said that because I had written in my notebook all year long that I had an IEP, I was given extra time on tests and such. I had to find out why she had written it down. Then I found out that the girl next in line after me in the attendance book had an IEP and had written IEP next to my name. Story 39. When I was moderating a trivia show, a guy came up to me after the show was over and we debated the answers. The question was which animal is, and the answer was bees. The man insisted that the answer was correct because he said, "Bees are not animals, they are insects." I tried to politely and discreetly correct him, saying that bees are indeed insects, but insects are part of the animal kingdom, and therefore bees are animals. Bees are insects like ants and grasshoppers, not animals like dogs and cats. They are not animals like dogs or cats. I was convinced he was imagining a mammal. I finally pulled out my freshman-level college biology knowledge, which for some reason I still remember, and said, "You know what? In fact, according to the standard scientific classification system of kingdom, phylum, order, family, genus, and species, bees belong to the arthropod phylum of the animal kingdom. So unless you consider bees to be plants or fungi, you must agree that they are animals." He did not agree. Story 40. This is when I showed my friend a picture of my business trip abroad. It was a legitimate business trip to Darjeeling and surrounding areas, where I tested and bought products and corresponded with producers regarding quality control. Darjeeling is a gorgeous country, and I was in a gorgeous place. My roommate came in and started ranting about how ecotourism is really bad for developing economies, how we shouldn't take advantage of people, and in other words, how much we paid to pretend we were poor. It didn't cost me a lot of money. I got to work with people who were knowledgeable and able to do the job, and I learned a lot. Plus, I bought tons of tea, literally tractor trailer size, while I was there. Story 41. I work at a bar. I'm a guy in my early 20s, and a couple of women in their late 30s/early 40s came in, and were looking at the wine menu. They made a lot of the usual comments, which basically boiled down to you're a guy, you don't know anything about wine. One literally said she didn't care what I thought. Whatever, a bar jerks. We finally settled on a pretty C****Y wine that they only carry there due to a contract with a supplier. Whatever. Then a female staff member was serving us, and they weren't happy with our last order. They had questions about some of the wines. The staff member said, I drink mostly beer, so I don't really know. I grabbed the bar manager, and he is writing the wine menu. At that point, I was in a very good mood. Story 42. I have glasses that can stop bullets, and I don't talk much, so most of the time people think I'm a poor guy. The farmer was a family friend, so he knew I could do anything that didn't involve engines. One day, I was on groundhog duty. Basically, I would sit on the porch or in one of the silos with a .22 caliber gun and wait for the groundhog to pop his head out and take care of it. I am by no means an expert marksman, but after doing this job for a long time and getting used to the sights on the rifle, I was able to hit the groundhog 8 out of 10 times. It was fun because instead of shoveling trash with a sore back, all I had to do was sit and wait. So a new guy came in who had apparently been kicked out of boot camp, and he let everyone know how the government had panicked when they kicked him out. When he found out I was on groundhog duty, he started screaming that I was blind and couldn't hit anything, and that the farmer was SD for letting a RD carry a gun. So we went at it with some canned goods along the fence, but he could only get a couple. Then he had a fit and left for the day, even though he had to work. Story 43. I was volunteering at a college open day. I was in an elevator with a mother and her bright-eyed, excited daughter. I was wearing a fashionable dress, heels, and laces. I looked approachable, and the teenager excitedly asked what I was doing in college. Knowing that high school students don't know what bioinformatics is, I replied, I'm an assistant biology instructor. A side job as a tutor that makes them guess that I am a PhD candidate. The student wanted to know more and asked, what does that involve? Before I could explain, the mother interjected and looked the other way, snickering. She does clerical work for the university. The mother had judged me by my attire. I smiled and politely explained to my daughter that I was studying for a PhD in bioinformatics and that it was common for me to teach genetics courses on the side for extra income. I then explained what bioinformatics was. The mother was stunned because she did not understand a word of what I said, and the student was amazed and wanted to attend all my classes. Story 44. My first job out of college was as a programmer for a small VR company. Back in 2005, VR was a real niche, so our clients were mainly large companies and universities. One of the first jobs I was given was to write new stereo projection software for a projection rig. A few months later, when I was back home on vacation, my boss called me and told me that a local university in my hometown had encountered a problem with a recent installation that seemed to need a little walkthrough and explanation. So I decided to stop by that university one afternoon. When I arrived, a lab technician met me at the reception desk and took me to the lab where the installation was taking place. After he left, a group of graduate students came over and we talked about it. And they thought I was an undergraduate. I was 20 years old, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, just fiddling with the projector controller. One know-it-all in the group opened his mouth to say that I was trying to screw up the system because it relies on both projectors being slightly out of focus. I corrected him and explained that it was a passive device, hence the different polarization filters for each projector to match one eye of the glasses. The professor and the engineer came back and stopped by to give me a brief explanation between vacations, the perfect time to introduce me as the author of the software that makes this system work. Story 45. I have a great one. I was once pulled out of a film company I was trying to start up. For some reason, the head of that company decided that the only value I had to offer the company was a trump card to get my father to help me with something related to investments. My father never invested the money, but still helped me in other ways. They made a complete fool of me. They wasted a year of my life writing a script that was never going to do anything, took me on a trip to where they were supposed to mentor me, fired me, and eventually left me in a restaurant while I went to the bathroom. They wasted a year and a half of my time. They ended up funding another filmmaker's script later that summer, though. That bad film bombed for $500,000 in a small-town production, and the company went bankrupt. I, on the other hand, got my story written and am currently paying for law school with the funds. Story 46. I worked as a volunteer preparing taxes for low-income individuals and families. This required me to qualify through the IRS. I qualified as best I could and rapidly became not only the best preparer for my site, but was also promoted to quality examiner. I continued in this job for several years, donating more hours each year than anyone else, with the exception of the site coordinator, whose role required him to attend every hour our site was open, as well as devote extra hours at other sites. This is a picture of my qualities and skills. This young man needs to deal with his taxes for the past 3 years at a time. In U.S., tax returns are due for up to 3 years. I could tell from his appearance that despite being young and eligible for our services, he was actually doing very well on his own. My site coordinator asked me to prepare his taxes for him because he had to pay taxes for 3 years. This was because he needed 3 years worth of taxes and was going to be a handful. But he had quite a few tax forms, and the site coordinator knew I could handle them quickly and accurately. So I started with the oldest year, and we talked a bit as I keyed his taxes. He does union work in an industrial park. He is young, just bought a new car a few years ago. This is a point of pride we talked about at length. He bought it new, dressed it up with fancy rims, custom paint, etc. Gets raises every year, etc. People talk about all sorts of things while waiting for the tax accountant, but honestly, it can be distracting. Anyway, as I was looking through his file, I discovered something startling. I noticed that he had withdrawn a significant amount of money from his retirement account. This is not something any person should do, unless it's like disaster relief, when you lose your home in a hurricane. Natural disasters are basically unheard of where we live. Unless you have a good reason from a specific list of reasons provided by the government, you not only have to pay taxes on your severance pay, you also have to pay a fine. In short, since severance pay is pre-tax money, you can use a loophole to evade taxes without adding a substantial fine. In effect, I can do that. I paused on my current tax return and noticed that he was doing this for each of the following year's returns as well. So I did a little more digging. I told him I noticed he was withdrawing money from his retirement account and asked him why. His explanation was to purchase a new car. As you can imagine, that is not on the approved list. I already understood that what he was thinking was taking advantage of the system. He was using his retirement account like a checking account, making maximum contributions to his retirement account to get maximum match from his employer. Money in, money out, whatever, because it was his money. Frankly, I felt a little sorry for the man. I didn't know him, and he was from a less fortunate part of society. His address was rather telling of this fact. My IRS certificate included federal protection from being sued for the volunteer work I was doing, as long as I did not commit some sort of tax fraud. Trying to help this man right past wrongs involved tax fraud. No thanks. Since there wasn't much left to do in his file after the retirement withdrawal, I figured I'd make quick work of that year's taxes and then give him a life lesson from the school of hard knocks. I feel so bad for them because I don't know what will happen. Finally, the time came. I began to tell him that I had done the math on his tax return and braced myself as I revealed that he owed me a significant amount of money on his tax return, and it was going to be a lot, too, since he still had a few years of tax returns left to file that did the same thing. His immediate response was, "I must have done something wrong." Okay, not the response I was expecting, but denial is one of the stages of grief, so I began to explain how I arrived at that number. I explained that retirement money is pre-tax money, so it is taxable, but that there are also fines and that you cannot withdraw that money for everything. He keeps insisting that I did something wrong. It was the most complicated file I have ever done, and I know I did nothing wrong because I am very diligent, but at this point he is getting a little fussy, so I called the site coordinator to take a quick look at the file and double-check my work. This kid is pinning all his hopes on me being an idiot, but when the site coordinator repeated the bad news, the kid started acting as if everyone else had lost their minds. The child and the site coordinator began arguing about how he thought he was not supposed to be behind on his taxes, and the site coordinator calmly explained that he could not withdraw money from his retirement account to pay back taxes plus fees, unless he was in financial difficulty. The kids tried to change the subject. Yes, this is due to financial hardship. But my site coordinator had already heard him say it was for a new car purchase. It is worth adding that we serve people who are really at rock bottom, and we know what economic hardship looks like every day because many of the people we serve make very little money to live on. The child is defensive and says he will take his job elsewhere. Only a small percentage of the people we serve think we volunteers care where they get their tax accountant. My site coordinator's response of "it's okay" was clearly not what the kid was expecting. He thought he had influence over those of us who threatened to go elsewhere, and instead figuratively stuck his face in his threats. I wish this story had had a better ending, but all I know is that he never came back to our site, so I can only assume that he was told the same thing we told him and that he paid his taxes elsewhere. He never learned from us what to say to the next tax evader who commits tax evasion, only that a new car is not an excuse to empty his retirement account every year. Story 47. Yes, my family moved during spring break of 6th grade. We moved from Alabama to Louisiana, and the education system in Louisiana is really bad. Plus, the new school was a magnet school specializing in math and science. There were only 6 weeks left in the semester, so the teachers wouldn't let me take tests for the first couple of weeks, and the tests I took at the end of the semester didn't count because the curriculum was a little different. However, the math I was doing at this new school was way behind the math I was used to. Partly because my grades didn't mean much, and partly because I didn't want to be a know-it-all. I was completely intimidated in that class and stopped paying much attention. But this had the opposite effect on my reputation. My classmates and teachers thought I was just a slacker and didn't care. 5 weeks into my new school year, my math class was reviewing for the final exam. I was in the very back of the class, drawing in my notebook. When I heard my name called, my nice teacher said, "Hey, the 2ND Socrates, you probably need to study because you have to take this test next week in class." Now, what is the answer to this question? Let's take your time. At this point, I could see my class trying to figure out the answer to this basic algebra problem, while at the same time making eye contact with each other, knowing that the slow-footed girl would not understand. I looked at the board for a full 5 seconds before I told her the answer. She just looked at me, then at the board, and told me to show her my work because she wanted to show it to the class. I held up my notebook and told her that what she thought I was writing was actually a drawing of Luffy from One Piece. Eventually, I was able to get a 100% on the test. I was the only one who got a 100%, and no one doubted my ability. However, many people thought I was a know-it-all, and because of this, I spent most of middle school with 0 friends, so my plan failed TLDR. Because I didn't pay attention in class, my teachers and classmates thought I was slow. I ended up solving math problems in my head within 5 seconds while my classmates were writing out their work. Story 48. My sister-in-law always made fun of my English. Whenever I mispronounced something, she would start laughing and tell everyone, "She's so cute. She can't pronounce this, and that." I always thought she was a mean girl trying to keep her attention to herself, but the English thing really bothered me. One day we were having a drink, and she started laughing at something I said. I told her that she could barely speak English, and I could speak 3 languages. I told her that I could speak 3 languages while she could barely speak English. She took an online English practice test, and I got a perfect score. She got an 8 out of 12, and that was the last time she laughed at me. It was a sweet victory. Just because you speak English doesn't mean you're smarter than the rest of us. Editor. Wow, this was an overnight blast. I'm from Colombia and now live in Canada. I speak Spanish, English, and French. To all of you who have tried to learn a second language, but say it's too difficult, try again. It takes years and a lot of effort, but it will open your eyes to a whole new world. Story 49. When I was in college, I went to an architecture exhibition with my lecturer. The lecturer, rest his soul, was a typical South London geezer. He was highly educated, but modest in his roots, and spoke with a Cockney accent. He had a question about some element or another concerning an exhibit and found a museum staff member to assist him. The woman was a very neat, proper-looking, well-spoken older woman. Perhaps she was volunteering to break up the monotony of the garden parties and bridge nights that occupied most of her existence. So, my well-educated lecturer asked questions in an articulate and erudite manner, but with an obvious accent. I don't know exactly what happened to the lady, but she clearly did not know the answer. Instead of politely admitting that she didn't know but could find out, etc., she short-circuited and tried to answer an entirely different question than the one posed while condescending to him in the most condescending manner I have ever seen. It was like a defective C-3PO explaining himself to a toddler for the 50th time. We then just looked at each other, thanked her, and continued on our way. This woman must have felt insecure and threatened by the fact that a commoner expressed himself that way and knew more than she did, and tried to put him in a position to cover her own lack of knowledge. In the end, she seemed really S***D and confused. Class is still a big thing in England. You can ignore it, but eventually it creeps up on you and hits you in the face. I have had similar experiences, but this time it was surreal. It made me wonder how many times throughout his life this highly educated man had been talked down to or tried to get him to stand his ground TLDR. A highly educated Cockney lecturer asked a posh museum volunteer a question he didn't know how to answer. Story 50. When I was in 8th grade, we had just learned about the seasons and the Earth's rotation, and to my surprise, my teacher told us that during the winter, the Earth is actually closest to the sun. But it's cold because of the tilt of the Earth's axis, not because it's closer to the sun. The tilt determines the seasons. Soon after that, I went to math class, and my math teacher told me that it is cold because it is far from the sun. Of course, I said that what my science teacher had taught me was wrong. Then the math teacher vehemently criticized me in front of the whole class. He was a light-hearted teacher, famous for always making fun of the kids. The teacher and I argued for a while, but I especially remember the teacher saying, "Oh yeah, when it's cold, stay away from the fire." I remember he said, and I kept retorting, No, it's the tilt of the Earth. And he kept refuting me. And finally he Googled it and found out I was right. He at least complimented me and then admitted he was wrong, lol. Story 51. It was over 20 years ago, but I still remember when I moved to a new school at age 14. I was not very social anxiety disorder, and did not make friends right away. On top of that, I didn't study, didn't do my homework, and often failed tests, except for some subjects, see below. Eventually, some of my classmates started calling me dumb. For some reason, they had nicknames for me in Katakana Dutch. We were French-speaking Belgians. Probably because we didn't have Dutch classes until that year, and I was struggling with the Dutch language, see. I didn't study it. Then, more than a month after we arrived, a math problem, I forget what it was written on the blackboard, and the teacher was listening to the answers. A few of the louder students gave wrong answers, and I became more and more convinced that my answers were correct. Math had always been my strong subject. I had scored 98% the previous year, but I was still very reluctant to speak up. So I spoke up, which was unusual for me, because I was so reluctant to speak up. Especially after the transfer. I said the right things. I started speaking up more and more in math class, and my stereotypes began to be overturned. A few weeks later, the same thing happened in English class. For the first time, we had a session called Let's Listen to and Understand the BBC News. The teacher showed us a news clip and started asking who could tell what the clip was talking about. I raised my hand and summarized the clip. Note that this session had a side effect. I was skipped in the next session. I was not a fan of the English class because it was boringly easy. The Dutch class was infuriatingly confusing, and I was not a fan of the dumb stereo. From that day on, the stereotype of dumb changed to smart but lazy. The nickname remained for a while, but at that point it was used sarcastically. In addition, the dumb but lazy stereotype was actually more damaging to me than dumb. I never internalized the dumb stereotype. But for a long time I internalized that I was lazy. After all, I didn't do my homework, I didn't study. Truth be told, I am not lazy. But procrastination is not a problem of laziness. It is a problem of anxiety. I was skipping homework and studying because of social problems. When I was released from school, the last thing I wanted to do was remember that. Remember the taunts I frequently had to endure. Story 52. My stepmom has been doing that since I first met her when I was 8 years old. The problem is that she is really SD and doesn't listen to social pleasantries at all. So many times when I was a kid, she would literally stand up and point at me and laugh, which deeply offended people. Unfortunately, Scandinavian culture is not good at confronting people. As a side effect of this, I have no hesitation in checking that I really know what I am talking about and saying I was wrong. So now when she tries to pull that C***P, I go into full lecture mode and calmly explain every single nuance around the facts. I'm a teacher, so that's not hard to do. The other day, she claimed that self-driving cars are secretly programmed to be racist. So I spent the next 5 minutes explaining what a colossal idiot she is. Story 53. In high school, I think there was a pretentious teacher with a PhD who insisted on being called a doctor. That teacher taught a lot of other AP classes, so he knew most of the other kids in the class who took AP. I only took CP, college prep, classes until my junior year, and that was honors under AP. He actually hated me, even though he got along with the other students. Anyway, one day in class he was talking about border restrictions and how the US is friendly with Canada, but you need a passport to cross the border. But I know this C***P because I am a dual citizen. As of 2018, when I took the class, I did not need a passport to travel, but coincidentally, I traveled without one that same summer due to personal issues. There I was told, if you are crossing overland, you don't need one. All you need is a birth certificate and a driver's license, to which he blurted out that I was wrong, and that one of his PhD classes was on international relations and border security, among other things. That's why you couldn't be a college professor, doctor. If Dr. Swanson is reading this, go ahead and get drunk on your superiority complex. Story 54. Of course, I am an adult now, so this does not apply to me as much, but the most common time this happened to me was when I was in high school. I was a junior and had to change schools in the middle of the school year. My grandmother and I were in the office doing paperwork, etc. My grandmother has a severe speech impediment, starting with a severe impediment and an old surgery that split her jaw in two, but she is rather intelligent and a very kind person. I was 17 years old at the time and was a sort of interpreter for her. I also have a speech impediment in our family. We both had a super hard time saying the name of a certain insurance policy, and we were sitting there amused at each other's failures. But then the woman who helped us took a huge leap of logic. It was only when she started talking extremely slowly to us and trying to explain very basic concepts that I realized her assumptions. I later had to reprimand her as best I could for disrespecting my poor grandmother's mental faculties. I didn't care about her assumptions about me. A few weeks later, I realized something was wrong. This woman put me on a remedial course where I slept and did very little. I turned in unrequested projects and even answered other people's questions. The English teacher even barged into my office and demanded to know why in the world I was in her class, and even spoke with all the AP and honors teachers in my grade to see if they could move me. In her words, "Why would you put a kid in my class who sleeps all day and still gets a 98? Are you kidding me?" The lady in the office was a counselor who was out of town the day I registered, but I guess they needed to get her involved in the process. Story 55. In my senior year, I had just moved from Germany to England, and because of this I was placed in the lowest set of each subject for the lowest performing students. It turned out that teachers were also assigned according to their students' abilities, and I ended up with some really **D teachers who couldn't explain how they were hired. One such teacher was a science teacher who taught the relationship between time, speed, and distance, and that if your speed was the lowest, you could run the fastest. I kept refuting her, saying that this was not true, but she tried to convince me by showing me a 100-meter race and saying, "Look, the winner has a low figure of 9.88 seconds, while the second-place finisher has a high figure of 9.96 seconds. The whole class believed her and said things like, "It's outrageous to argue with a teacher." A few days later, after talking to another science teacher, she realized how wrong she was, but only told me about it outside of class. The whole class still believed her logic and said I was a bad student for arguing with her. I was soon one of the top students in each subject. Story 56. I had a racist colleague who had a rather narrow-minded view of people in the Middle East and Islam for that matter. He was spouting nonsense about how all Muslims are basically evil and Christians have never done anything nefarious, etc. I usually keep my opinions about religion and politics to myself, but this time I just couldn't help myself. We both grew up going to Catholic schools, and a lot of them forget about the Crusades. So I told him the story. This boy thought I was either lying or ***D. So, after debating with me for about 25 minutes about whether or not that was actually what happened, I told him to use the phone in his pocket to Google the Third Crusade. He looked a little confused. Third? He asked. So I said, yes, apparently the first two weren't good enough, so they decided to do it again. But it's okay, because the Pope said all is forgiven because they raped, killed, and burned an entire village in the name of God. And he Googled it, realized this was very common knowledge, and pouted for the rest of the shift. TLDR, my racist colleague said that there were 3 crusaders and was stunned to realize that there was a crusade. Edit. Autocorrect attacked me, so I fixed a few grammar issues. Story 57. I didn't know anyone particularly close, but I had hung out with a group of people I had hung out with a few times. Among them was a man who subtly made fun of my intelligence all afternoon. Clearly, he thought he was smart enough to insult me to my face without me noticing. I noticed it, of course, but didn't care enough about his opinion to actually call him out on it. Anyway, he was clearly trying to disrespect me by challenging me to a game of chess, which was right there. I had never really studied chess seriously at the time, but I used to play it with my buddies over whiskey. I wasn't very good at it, still am not, but I knew enough not to get led by this guy. Besides, it was a good way to pass the time. Well, we played our first game, and I caught him with Scalar's mate. For those who don't know, Scalar's made his checkmate in just 4 moves. He angrily told me he wasn't ready and wanted a rematch. I thought, fine, and played 2 deliberately irrelevant moves first, then played Scalar's mate again. He accused me of not playing fair and walked away. I just smiled quietly. He never said I was SD after that, though. Story 58. When I first joined the military, I went to a school so it was full of absolute recruits fresh out of boot camp. And because of its rustic atmosphere and strict policies, there were tons of traditional events that would not exist outside of that base. I was in my 5th week of classes. At this point, I had been there 7 months waiting for classes and 5 weeks actually learning, and there was this strict policy about using cell phones that I was almost done with. And as I was walking off the base in plain clothes to eat and fiddling with my phone, the chief, E7, stopped me and started berating me for fiddling with my phone. When he saw the instructions, he immediately turned and walked away, while the CMC began lecturing him for not reading the updated instructions as this fine young sailor did. Story 59. Often. Blonde girls doing science and math. It happens all the time. I rebelled a bit against one of my teachers and didn't turn in my homework even though I always did it. He would make me mark the homework myself and just look at the score on the paper I turned in. Many used the same paper over and over again, and they never even noticed. Also, there were no penalties for not turning in homework, which really annoyed our teachers. They wanted to retire, but we had to ask them to stay because we were short on math students, and since we had 2 classes together, there were not enough desks in the classroom, not enough room to stand, and some could not get to class. They also did not coordinate whether or not they could actually cover the curriculum, as they would take turns teaching for 2 weeks and then take a break. I felt alienated because they always pandered to those who couldn't be bothered. So, of course, I didn't want to ruin my education, but I also didn't want to be the perfect student if they cared at all. After the January exam, we all had a 10-minute review, one-on-one. When it was my turn, they ranted at me about how I couldn't do it with my looks and being the special token girl for this exam, how my terrible performance in class was the reason for my poor grade on the exam, and how I would never be an engineer at Oxbridge. I sat there calmly and waited for him to finish his lecture. Then I asked him if he had read what grade I got. He said no, but of course I would have done terribly. I wouldn't have been able to keep up with everyone else. Asked him to load and check my scores. I got a perfect score of 100%. I looked at him again in silence. Everyone in the class heard him lecturing me and being condescending and sexist. He then told me to leave the classroom and to stop being so cocky because I would fall behind if I didn't. Later that year, I went to Cambridge, got the highest marks, and they wrote a short article about me in the local newspaper. I would have loved to have seen what happened then. The next year, when I got into Cambridge, the head of research told me that I was accepted because I was a girl for diversity reasons and that the admissions officer had an eye for blondes. He told me this, actual quote, "Bristol is a great university and he is a snob." But secondly, my graduation day was the most satisfying ever because I got third in my grade, the highest rank of anyone he taught, won a university academic award and scholarship, and was told to come back for my PhD. I think my favorite thing about being a blonde girl is proving the sexists wrong through STEM academics and male-dominated careers. Sexists are always most happy to see you squirm when you know you've lost. Edit. Thanks to Silver for reading my post all the way through. Story 60. This actually happens to me a lot because of my ethnicity. It's because when Maoris are in the news, it's usually about crimes and criminal activity, but people doing good things rarely get reported until years later. When I am on job seekers, having just finished my studies, the people who help me find a job automatically assume that I cannot read or write and insist that I should not apply for jobs that require such skills and should only do labor jobs. I don't mind labor, but the person just read the resume I gave him, told him I had written and typed, and asked what I had studied. He still asked if I could read and write and if I could count from 1 to 10. So I said back. I asked him if it was difficult for him to read back the first sentence of the biography on my resume. Computer technology, programming, software development. He said. I told him to read it again. After an argument, he had to formally apologize to me. I had to repeat myself over and over again because he assumed from my appearance that I was uneducated and ignored my education. This is one of many stories.